Hey guys, it's chapter 28 on Civil Wars, Liberal Crisis, and Conservatives' Rebirth from 1961 to 1972. We'll talk about Lyndon Baines Johnson's, or LBJ, move on to women's rights and gay liberation as well. We'll then talk about Vietnam heavily. So we'll talk about JFK in Vietnam, LBJ in Vietnam, and then Richard Milhous Nixon's in Vietnam as well, and finish it up with the Warring Corps. So let's get started right away. This is LBJ's Great Society. So you already know that LBJ passed the 24th Amendment, the Civil Rights Acts, and the Voting Rights Acts. We are now focusing on the economic opportunity and what becomes known as this war on poverty that LBJ announces. So the war on poverty is basically social programs to fight social problems. So one of the things that he passes is the Head Start, and Head Start provided free schoolings to poor disadvantaged children, and they were able to start kindergarten right off the top. The Job Corps provided young people with training and employment, and Vista, Volunteers in Service to America, offered technical assistance to the urban and rural poor. The next major piece of legislation that LBJ signs is the Medicare Act, and this establishes two programs: Medicaid, which offer healthcare to the poor, and Medicare, which offer healthcare to the elderly. So these are the two ones that you need to look from here. We're going to move on now. That's LBJ, by the way, in a commencement speech where he talks about his Great Society. So make sure you know that term, Great Society, and the war on poverty. In terms of education, you definitely need to know these three. So first of all, the Elementary and Secondary Act provided federal aid for education to help the poor. The National Endowment for the Arts and Humanities provided federal funding to support artists and scholars. And Higher Education Act provided federal scholarships for post-secondary education. Post-secondary means colleges. So this is kind of something that you guys might be interested in, that the federal government is now providing scholarships for college students. In terms of the Housing and Urban Development, the Housing and Urban Development, the one you need to know is Housing and Urban Development Act, or what becomes known as HUD. So it created the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and what they did, it built thousands of public housing units for the poor. It also helped with rapid transit, new child safety and consumer law protections, and it helped with scholars. It helped with people being able to live and travel safer. And then finally, the one in miscellaneous here, you need to know the Immigration Act of 1965. First of all, it did two things. One, it abandoned national quotas of 1924, allowing more non-European immigrants to enter the country. And the one that doesn't appear here, but the one that you want to know, is that it also allowed for close relatives of legal residents living in the United States to petition to have other relatives living in another country to come into the U.S. as well. So that's the Immigration Act. Again, we're loosening up a little bit on immigration restriction, and this is all under Lyndon B. Johnson. In terms of the effects of the Great Society, in other words, how successful was the Great Society in these programs, it was actually pretty successful. And this kind of sounds like the New Deal. That was because LBJ was a disciple of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So Franklin Delano Roosevelt was a mentor to LBJ, and LBJ wanted to continue with the social programs that were established under Roosevelt's New Deal. So that's what the Great Society is mimicked under. Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal. So the effects, one more time: poverty did go down from 20% in 1963 to 13% in 1968, so 5% a drop. It did improve the financial situation for the elderly. It reached millions of children who were going to school. It increased racial diversity in society and in the workplace. However, just because it increased diversity, it didn't mean that it was always peaceful. It did create some conflict as well. And of course, it gave healthcare to the elderly and the poor. And a lot of people continue to benefit from Medicaid and Medicare even today. So long-term effects of the Great Society. Let's talk about women's rights now. So in the 1950s, women started to campaign for maternity leave and equal pay for equal work. So maternity leave is when a female gives birth and she is home nursing the child. The workplace needs to allow her that opportunity to go and nurse for her child, and then after a certain amount of time, she's able to come back to work. And of course, equal pay for equal work is that women should get paid the same amount of money for the same type of job that they're doing that of men. And that's what the Equal Pay Act in 1964 provided. However, it wasn't practiced properly. And then we have a major influential book It's called The Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan, and that's Betty Friedman here. And so this book was targeted, the audience for this book were educated middle-class women. And in the book, Betty Friedman, she argued that women needed an education and to work outside the home to feel full and happy. So we start seeing again this feminist, now more of an educated feminist type of movement than that in the past. And then during the 1960s, we have birth control, which reduces birth rates. And so now women are no longer tied to the home because of having children. They are a little bit more liberated and have this opportunity to get an education and be able to work outside. By 1970, 42% of women in the United States were enrolled in colleges, the highest up until that point in U.S. history ever. And if you guys remember again, the Civil Rights Act, which prohibited discrimination based on race. Well, in 1965, the word sex was added to protect women from discrimination as well. So all this new knowledge, all this new education, and the skills to be able to organize and fight for equality, we create a new grassroots organization, the National Organization of Women, or NOW, formed to fight for women's rights. So this was a civil rights movement for women, and NOW was influenced by the civil rights of the African Americans. And this is one of the symbols that continues to be used today. So again, major organization for women, and that organization still exists today as well. We'll see what they did. So women's liberation here. So this is also a grassroots organization. Grassroots means that it is an organization started by civilians to fight for civil rights. So the women's liberation was a new form of feminist movement. It was young, college-educated females in favor of civil rights. They were considered liberals, reformers, and they were asking for egalitarianism, which means equality. And here we see also thousands of people protested in major cities for different reasons. So in the top one, we see equality, the time is now, referring to the National Organization of Women. And then down here, we see equal pay for equal work. And unfortunately, we still continue to fight that even today. Women began to ask for access to abortion, clinics, and pills as well. They also asked for justice for harassment in the workplace. And then finally, in 1972, I want to say, Title IX, that should say Title IX, not Title 11. Title IX allowed women to participate in competitive sports in high school and colleges. Before that, women were allowed to participate in sports, but not competitive sports. So now we are giving a little bit more rights to women, even in the high schools and colleges. So we do see that the women's rights movement, women's liberation, and now National Organization of Women do have a little bit of success in terms of what they were fighting for as well. We'll move on and talk about, introduce Vietnam. So just to make sure, a lot of people confused what the Viet Cong was. And so the Viet Cong were Southern Vietnamese communist sympathizers. For the most part, South Vietnam were not communist, but there were some people in South Vietnam that were communist sympathizers. They are known as Viet Cong. So make sure you keep that. So we'll start with JFK and Vietnam. So JFK, he mentioned that a withdrawal from Vietnam, or what becomes known as Nam, would weaken America's credibility, especially during the midst of the Cold War. So if the United States was unable to be successful in a tiny country like Vietnam, then it cannot be successful in other major countries. So JFK did not want to withdraw troops from Vietnam. He continued to aid Southern Vietnamese leader Ngo Dinh, but he began to lose patience and supported a military coup. So Diem, the reason why JFK grew impatient, because Diem eliminated his political opponents using ruthless tactics, and he also proved to be corrupt. We mentioned this a couple chapters earlier. The United States gave $2 billion for his cause. A lot of that money he just pocketed. So eventually, he was assassinated by the CIA in 1963, I believe. JFK, what he wanted a strong Southern Vietnamese leader to repeal the National Liberation Front, NLF, or the Viet Cong, again, Southern Vietnamese communist sympathizers. So he wanted to not only eliminate the Southern Vietnamese sympathizers, communist sympathizers, but also eliminate, obviously, communism in North Vietnam. So JFK, he starts to get engaged in the Vietnam War. Again, he tries to help the civil rights movement for African Americans. Unfortunately, his goals and his agenda, he did not live to see the fruition of this because he is assassinated. Once he is assassinated, Lyndon B. Johnson, LBJ, becomes president, and now Lyndon B. Johnson needs to deal with the war in Vietnam. So LBJ vowed to not lose Vietnam the way Harry Truman lost China to communism. He did not want to be considered that president that lost Vietnam to communism. So in 1964, July 1964, we have the Gulf of Tonkin incident, where apparently North Vietnamese boats fire at U.S. destroyers. That proved to be a lie. The first attack, apparently the Gulf of Tonkin, they had 2 attacks. The first attack, it proved to be that it was just a simple bullet that hit a destroyer, a U.S. destroyer. The second attack actually was just something that the United States made up. And they made that up so that the United States has a reason to attack the Northern Vietnamese. After the Gulf of Tonkin incident, we have the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. This is basically the president, LBJ, asked Congress to give him a blank check so that he could conduct operations in Vietnam as he saw it fit. In other words, the LBJ was able to do whatever he wanted to attack the Northern Vietnamese. In 1964, when he runs for president, he promised that American boys would not be sent to fight in Vietnam. And because of that promise, he was reelected. And what does he do the very next year? He deploys American troops to Vietnam, and fighting escalates. So unfortunately, he does not fulfill his promise. And Americans began to grow frustrated that Lyndon B. Johnson pledged something, but he is doing something else. So this is the Gulf of Tonkin. So this is Vietnam right here. That's the country of Vietnam. This is the Gulf. That's the Gulf of Tonkin. This is more of a little inside map here. So the Gulf of Tonkin, you see troops from North Vietnam, troops from the United States and South Vietnam. So apparently some of these troops fire at American ships, which causes the Gulf of Tonkin incident. And because of that, LBJ then uses that incident to strengthen, in essence, his war powers. And the war in Vietnam completely escalates under LBJ. And then we have Operation Rolling Thunder. It takes place from February 1965 to October 1968, just about when Lyndon B. Johnson leaves office. This is a massive American bombing against North Vietnam. And what Lyndon B. Johnson wanted to do was dispirit the Northern Vietnamese and the Viet Cong from continuing to fight. But it actually has the opposite effect, because a lot of this bombing did not kill the enemy. North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong were more determined to fight the Americans and to completely keep them out of Vietnam in general. The bombing did devastate cities and villages across Vietnam. We see a map over here more or less. So the orange right here, that's North Vietnam. And these blue arrows, they represent all the bombing that the United States launched against North Vietnam. Again, it wasn't very successful in trying to dispirit the Northern Vietnamese and the Viet Cong from fighting the Americans and South Vietnamese sympathizers as well. Let's talk about the Tet Offensive now. So the Tet Offensive took place on January 30th, 1968. Basically what it was is a Viet Cong coordinated assault on southern Vietnam and against Americans. So if you look at the map here, this major trail, that's called the Ho Chi Minh Trail, that tells us, the key tells us here, and every little battle here that you see here, major battle, that's the Tet Offensive. So in one battle, the Northern Vietnamese launched an attack on all these cities that you see here. It was very, very well orchestrated and coordinated. Now, in terms of military terms, the Tet Offensive was actually a failure, because the Northern Vietnamese lost a lot of men and they were forced to retreat. However, it was a psychological effect on Americans. Americans felt like this was going to be a long and bloody and devastating war, and they had been in there for nearly 10 years now, and they no longer wanted to be there. So it was a psychological effect. And it also, since this was televised and reporters did report on it, it mocked the United States was actually winning the war, and people started to take to the streets to protest the Vietnam War. It also showed atrocities by Southern Vietnamese who were supposed to be part of the American, the Allies as well. So Tet Offensive has a major, major impact in terms of what Americans think of the war. In 1968, this is the most shocking year of the post-World War II eras. There's riots in U.S. cities, there's unrest in college campuses, violent battles in Vietnam like the Tet Offensive that I just talked about. And because of all of this, there's a sense of despair and hopelessness in America. There's also political turmoil because of what LBJ is doing. And then on April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King is assassinated. 2 months later, Robert Kennedy is assassinated. And all this leads to the Democratic Convention in Chicago 1968, where protesters faced off with police who used gas and clubs to fight protesters. And that's what you see in these two pictures, protesters fighting off against the police.